This video is a beginner's guide to translating a drawing into a hand embroidery. For this embroidery, I'm going to work with this printout of a photograph of an ink drawing, and I've placed it on a light box. You could place yours in a window, or you could place it on a glass table with a light underneath, and that would work just like a light box. So I'm going to trace off the lines of the drawing, and I'm going to use a cold water soluble marker. Now, in hand stitching, it's important to hoop up the work, and this keeps the work taut so that when you're stitching it doesn't start to pull together and create gathers. So for hand stitching, we need to make sure that the fabric is placed on top of the hoop. So I'm going to place the small hoop in underneath. I'm going to stitch this piece first because the drawing is too large for the hoop, so I need to choose which section is going to get stitched. So I've kept the outer hoop quite stiff or quite tight, so it will fit this lower hoop quite well. So I need to push quite firmly down. And now I have the drawing quite firmly in the hoop. You may wish to test the screw section and just make sure it's tight. Now the thread I'm going to work with is this crochet cotton. Crochet cotton is really handy for embroidery. It's quite cheap, comes in large spools, but you could really use any embroidery thread for this. Now I've cut about 1 meter of thread. Anything more than 1 meter and it becomes too difficult to stitch with, and it's going to knot and become difficult. It is advisable to work with the smallest needle that you possibly can. This one is an embroidery needle, and I'm working with the smallest of them, so it's probably a size 6. The smaller you work, as in the smaller the needle you work with, the faster you can do the stitching. So it should be a little bit difficult to get the thread into the eye of the needle, and then you can actually stitch a little bit faster. So what I normally do is I pinch the thread between my forefinger and my thumb, and then I push the eye of the needle down over the thread, and it should then go through in one go into the eye of the needle, and I'll pull a reasonable amount down then, ready to get started. So you've got a choice. I often will just tie a knot in the end of the thread. Technically for embroidery that's not the correct thing to do, so in the demonstration I will show you how to do that correctly. Now starting from underneath, so I'm going to turn the hoop over, and I'm going to start, I can just about see in the light coming through from behind, I'm going to start at the bottom of this particular section here, and I'm going to leave the thread hanging at the back. So I'll leave maybe 5 to 8 centimeters of thread at the back. So I can hold that then with my middle finger as I start to stitch. So in this case I have written in some notes here because I'm using a soluble pen. These marks will disappear when I'm done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a back stitch. A back stitch is where I am going to stitch backwards and then come forwards for the length of the stitch that I'm intending to make. So stitching back the correct length of stitch and then stitching forward, and I'm going to push the needle up then with my middle finger. Okay, so you can see there that I have the needle coming back the length of the stitch and forward the length of the stitch. So I'm aiming here to make all of these stitches roughly the same length as each other. Okay, so again back to the previous stitch and then forward the same length as the previous stitch. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch back again to the previous stitch and forward roughly the same distance. Okay, and back and forward. Okay, so just to point out, once you get to a corner, what we'll do is we'll stitch to that corner stitch, going back to the previous stitch, and then simply going around the corner and moving forward in exactly the same way to the next stitch. And continuing on. Okay, and again back to the previous stitch and on to the next stitch. Back to the previous stitch and on to the next stitch. Now I've just reached a section here where I'm planning to do a little bit of satin stitching, and the thread is reasonably short, so I'm going to show you how to finish off. So I'm going to stitch through the last stitch. So this isn't a back stitch going forward anymore. I'm simply going to stitch to that last stitch through to the back of the hoop. And to finish off that thread neatly on the back, I'm going to turn the hoop over. And then I just need to back stitch through a selection of these stitches here with a few stitches in and out and in and out, so that the running thread has now been embedded in the embroidery at the back. So in and out, in and out. I can then pull the needle forward, and I'll trim with a very short thread so that I know where that thread has been embedded. And it will be the same here with the piece of thread where I started off. So I'm going to thread that into the needle, and that's why we left roughly this length. And to be honest with you, it is actually a little bit short. In hindsight now, I would have left a little bit extra. So with this one as well, I'm just going to back stitch. I'll do it in individual stitches now because the hoop is in the way. A very short thread at the end so that I know where it was pulled through. Okay, so I've just brought the thread up from the back, so I'm supporting the piece of work here with a finger from behind, and that will just help me to push the needle through and to bring it back up again. So satin stitch is where we're bringing the thread floating across the surface of the cloth in parallel rows. So the first one I will bring at this angle to here, and then I'm aiming to bring the needle back out immediately underneath the previous stitch that I had. Okay, so again I'm going to go back in where the last stitch was, underneath, and back up about 1 millimeter below the last stitch. Okay, so these rows of thread now will be sitting parallel to each other or beside each other. So I'll just move this out of the way. So the next one again, I'm coming in right underneath the last stitch and right out where the thread had come out with the last row. Okay, and settling the thread in each time. So now I am back into the back stitch. So this is my final satin stitch, but because I know I'm about to launch into back stitch, I'm going to come out in front of the satin stitch here by the length of the back stitch that I'm planning to do. Okay, and back into my normal back stitch pattern. I'm coming up to a strong curve here. I may need to make my stitches a little bit smaller, or I could simply convert that corner into, or sorry, that curve into a corner. I think I'll see what tiny stitches might look like. And maybe just one tiny stitch up on the end. Okay, so I think that that one tiny stitch on the very end just helped me to pivot around the corner. Now for the section here in the center of the leaf, I've decided to start with a stem stitch which will create a thicker line. So what I'm doing is I'm stitching slightly to the right of the line, and then I'm stitching slightly to the left of the line, but I'm placing the stitches at an angle to create more of a thicker stem effect. So stitching forward to about here and then stitching back to just in front of where the stitch had previously been. So just to demo that, stitching in front here 1 millimeter or 2 in front of the previous stitch, and then stitching back and trying to keep the angle the same as I go forward. Okay, so it's like a satin stitch on a steep angle. So stitching forward on the right hand side of the line and then stitching back to just in front of where the previous thread had been. For the next section of the drawing, which is this section here, so I'm going to do some running stitch to here and back down to here. So the intention with running stitch is that we're going to bring the needle in and out and in and out and in and out, creating a stitch and then a space and then a stitch and then a space. And again, the intention is that these are all even, but again, you can invent different sizes if you wish. So bringing the needle down and back. Now I can use my middle finger here to push the fabric up in order to push the thread through, which will speed me up. And for the next ones, I'll try to do 2 or 3 in one go. So putting the needle down, pushing it back up from underneath, putting the needle down, pushing it back up from underneath, putting the needle down and pushing it back up from underneath. And then I can pull through that number of stitches all in the one go. Okay, making this a much faster stitch. And for the next section, what I'm going to do, so that the gaps are a little bit smaller, I'm going to try and do smaller gaps in between the stitches. I'll try and keep the stitches roughly the same size. So stitching down, but this time taking a tiny little stitch before I come back up again. Stitching down, tiny little stitch before I come back up again. Down, tiny little gap. So again, with embroidery, what's great is you can make it up as you go along, pretty much. For a French knot, again, I want to come up where I want to start the knot. So I'm going to come up about here. And I'm going to leave the usual 7 or 8 centimeters at the back. What we want to do is we want to wrap the thread according to the instructions 3 times around the needle. So if I place the needle on this side of it, I can wrap 1, 2, 3. You will find with certain threads though, because they have a twist, and sometimes they will start to untwist as you're stitching. You will find with the French knots, they'll either work better if you're twisting over in this direction or putting the needle on the other side and twisting in the opposite direction. Now I need to take care with the first one because I haven't tied a knot on the back. So I'm going to wrap 1, 2, 3. And then the aim is to go back down where the stitch came out, but not exactly in the same hole where the thread came through, so maybe right beside it. Now I normally hold the wraps with my thumb while I bring the thread down through. What you end with is almost like a little donut shape where you've got the 3 little wraps and the 1 stitch holding them in place. Bringing the needle up where you want the French knot to be, and then I find it easier to put the embroidery down on the table because I need 2 hands for this. So taking the needle close to the surface of the fabric, we're trying not to wrap up here but close to the surface. So 1, 2, 3. and then bringing the needle down and bringing it back through the fabric close, so close to where the thread had come out, maybe 2 threads away. And then as I'm bringing the needle down through that little bundle of threads, I normally hold them in place with my other thumb and pulling the needle through to the back. And then again, you can see there is 1 stitch there holding all the other 3 little wraps in place. So there, I always think of them as pretty little donuts with this lovely little twist, or they're like little buns in your hair. Okay, so I'm going to do another 2 or 3. So bringing the needle up again where I want to place the next one. Placing the work flat on the table. And then wrapping the thread 1, 2, 3. Now I'm finding it hard to wrap right down at the cloth, but I'm pulling it then down closer to where I want the stitch to go. And then putting the needle back down where the original stitch came out. So the original stitch is here, so right beside it, back down, and then I like to hold those stitches in place with my other thumb and then pulling the needle through on the back. Okay, and again that nice little donut shape with the dot. They don't tend to look so neat in the first few, but again you can work on making them a little bit nicer as you go. Okay, so I'm going to fill in another few here, and then I'm going to come back to some satin stitch over here. So bringing the thread out. Chain stitch, I always find the easiest way to think of it is that I'm working with the thread inside a circle. So I'm making the loop here, and then I'm going to go back to where the thread had come out, and I'm going to stitch forward the length of the chain that I'm looking for. So again, there's some nice tension on the hoop here. I've got it placed on the table. So going back to here and stitching forward the length of the chain that I'm hoping to do, and completing that stitch within this loop will form the chain. So as I pull the thread forward, that loop forms. Now, not to pull the thread straight up, but pull it forward in the direction that I want the chain to go in. Now, if I pull that quite tight, it'll make that chain quite narrow, and I suppose a nice chain actually looks quite nice and round. So I'm going to do the first few quite round. So again, making this circle that I'm going to work within, and then going back to the previous thread. Now, so the thread is currently coming out of that loop. So in order to make the chain really neat, really I want to come back and meet the thread where it's coming out inside that loop and then stitch forward. Just coming along and going back in where the previous one has come out, and again working within the circle of thread that I've got here, bringing the needle up in roughly the same length as the previous stitch that I've made. So bringing that needle up within that circle again and pulling that thread forward will help me get a nice round chain effect. In where the previous thread came out and then stitching forward, try not to stitch into the thread itself, coming forward the length that the chain needs to be, and when I pull that forward in the direction that the stitch is going in, it makes a nice chain pattern. Okay, if I go directly over, so you can see there the nice loops that the stitch is creating. So now, and this is the finished chain section leaf. Okay, so seed stitch is placing random short stitches at different angles, again as if we had dropped some seeds onto the fabric. So I'm going to go outside of these lines to soften the effect. I'm trying to place all of these stitches in different directions. Now I am going to show you how to do a couching stitch. So couching is useful if you want to attach something slightly thicker down onto the surface of the fabric, and maybe it might be a little bit more difficult to embroider with. So because it's doubled, I'm just going to catch the thread at the back here to hold it down, And I'll just pull that stitch down. And I'm going to come up beside the thread. And then stitching across this thicker thread that I'm aiming to hold down. Generally, we're going to stitch across at right angles to the piece that we're stitching down. And then in the same process, I'm going to stitch forward ready for the next stitch. Okay, so this is the stitch I've stitched straight across, and then I'm coming out a little bit further down here ready for the next stitch. Okay, so I'm going to place the work flat on the table and change the camera angle. Okay, so twisting these two pieces again and laying them down onto the blue line that I'm following. Then I'm going to stitch across here on the other side and then coming up beside the piece that I'm stitching down onto the surface of the fabric. Okay, so one option is to place the crossing thread closer together. I could place a bunch of stitches, so I'm going to do a few maybe a little bit closer together here. Demonstrate what that might look like. Now the threads I'm working with are very close in colour, so you can imagine if this was, say, a gold thicker cord, and if I was stitching it down with a black, this would create a much more defined effect. Okay, so what I've created there is a little bunch of stitches as opposed to these single stitches. 2 or 3 stitches at the end. And I'm going to leave these pieces to hang as a special effect. Now I've just finished stitching, so I'm just going to remove the work from the hoop, and because I was using a cold water soluble pen or marker, I'm just going to dissolve the blue lines from the work. So giving it a light water spray mist. And I have a cloth here, then rubbing lightly, especially where I've done the running stitch. The cold water soluble pen is great because I can make it disappear totally. Now you can see through here I've got a lot of loose threads to tidy up on the back, so I do need to go back in on the back here and rethread onto the needle all of the ends of the loose threads to tidy up the work to make sure that it will stay stable.